G'day guys, today I'm just going to change out the suspension in the BT-50. This is the 2015 BT-50, so it has the same chassis and suspension setup as the Ford Rangers and Ford Territories. So I'll be going through the full install for the front and the rear. I'll be going through what I chose and why, and I'll briefly go through just choosing the correct suspension, when to buy it, pros and cons of overlifting and things like that. Going to have a look at the differences in the CV angles before and after lifting it. Going to look at the centre bearing spacer on the back drive shaft there to see how that angle changes and why we need to space it out to avoid vibration issues. In this particular model of car, that is an issue that can arise. We'll be measuring the difference in height between pre-install and post-install. I'll also be installing some bump stops, progressive bump stops that engage the chassis a little bit earlier. I'm going to cover the weight differences of all the different components as well as the total weight added to the car and all the costs and things like that as well. So a few little things to discuss before we get into the install, and chapters down below if you just want to skip ahead to the install. So a lot of people think this is a hard job to do, but it's actually really easy. There are some basic things you need like car jacks or bottle jacks. You need some car stands, we need socket sets, breaker bars, and a torque wrench. I'll be going through all the torque settings for all the important suspension components as we put it back together. So the first step is figuring out what spring rate you need. So here's a list of some of the weights that I've got at the front of the car. It adds up to about 140 kilos. So I was going for the heavy duty ones at the front. Now we'll just have a quick look at the website of the different packages they offer. And just looking at the suspension kits for the front, obviously you can buy assembled strut kits or you can buy the components separately. The assembled strut kits are just easier to put together, and then you get a brand new upper strut mount as well. So all of these packages have approximately a 50mm lift, because that is kind of the maximum recommended. The only thing that changes is, are you a factory setup? Do you have a steel bull bar, which is approximately 50 to 100 kilos? Do you have a steel bull bar and winch? So are you in the 100 to 150 kilogram load range? So you got 3, Trail, Expedition, Expedition HD. And then with the digressive, Trail, Expedition, Expedition HD. Adjustable bypass, Trail, Expedition, Expedition HD. So I've chosen the pre-assembled struts. This is an adjustable bypass, so we have control on the top here to change the firmness and the softness of the ride. So to better explain why I chose this particular setup, we'll just have a quick look at the website. Now that we know that Expedition HD is the weight that we want, we've got 3 choices. We've got performance, digressive, and adjustable bypass. The main reason I wanted the adjustable bypass wasn't actually for the bypass itself. It was for this threaded spring seat here, so you can actually adjust the ride height afterwards, and the reason I wanted this was so I could possibly lower the ride height if it was riding too high to reduce CV angles and not need an adjustable upper control arm. So the digressive and performance, I can't really explain the difference between them, but if you want to search something, and this gives a sort of overview on the differences between them. However, that is just an overview. You don't know to what extent these shocks are digressive or progressive or linear. Now you can see, if I flick through them back and forth, that the coil springs in the kit contents are exactly the same as are the strut mounts. So all you're doing is changing the shock from standard, DSV means digressive, and ADJ for adjustable. The other components in the kit are the same springs, same strut mounts. And just out of interest, the adjustable bypass Expedition and Expedition HD. So you can see the part number at the top changing as I flick between the two. And you can see in the details, the approximate load is changing, but you'll notice that the kit contents are exactly the same. So these are 2 different kits for different loads, but you have the same shock absorbers and you actually have the same springs as well. So the only thing that they're changing is the measurement of this threaded spring seat. When they send it out from factory, they'll preset that for you. So I was actually going to buy the Expedition because it comes with a lower threaded spring seat for this lower load, but it has the exact same components. And then I was going to raise it as necessary. But because I'm on the higher end of this 100 to 150 kilogram load rating for this higher threaded seat adjustment, I went with this setup because I wanted to see how high it was going to ride, which I think would be 50mm or less, because I'm on the higher end of this bracket. So you can see there's a few different choices there for setups with a steel bull bar and a winch. I've gone for the adjustable bypass because it comes with that threaded seat adjustment. and it also gives me the ability to change the control of the car for different driving scenarios. So when you lift your car, the wheels obviously tilt in a little bit, and then when you get a wheel alignment, they use the upper control arm to adjust that to get it aligned properly. If you lift it too far, you run out of adjustment. Then you run into problems with needing adjustable upper control arms. And the other thing that happens when you lift the car is you increase the CV angles, and this can lead to further breakages in the CVs by driving aggressively. Doesn't mean they will break, but it is just more likely that they will. This can be counteracted with a diff drop kit, and you just keep going down this rabbit hole of more problems, or a high likelihood of problems, and more purchases that you have to make. In this car, the diff drop kits are not simply bolt-ons. You kind of have to grind off a few things, parts of the original chassis, or you need to weld on the kit. It just seems like more drama than it's worth. I don't want to buy a diff drop kit, I don't want to buy adjustable upper control arms, and I don't want to break CVs. To avoid all these future costs and possible problems, I wanted to go with the adjustable spring seat, which comes on the adjustable bypass setup. Now, I've bought the assembled strut kit just because it's easier to install. You can buy all the components separately, put it together yourself, and I think it does work out a little bit cheaper. On the flip side, if you want a really high lift, then obviously you can thread that out as much as you want, and you can add these spring seat spacers that actually come in the kit to get even more lift if that's what you're after. With the adjustable spring seat, apparently the way IFS vehicles work, 5mm extra thread equals 10mm extra lift, and vice versa. Now, it is worth noting that when they say approximately 50mm lift, this is obviously dependent on where you fall in that 100 to 150 kilo bracket. So it could be more and it could be less, but it's also 50mm above the factory ride height with nothing installed. So if you have sagged suspension because you've installed lots of stuff, you'll see greater than a 50mm raise in height. If we look at the rear now, the kits are kind of the same, except you have one above Expedition HD, you've got the XHD, and the only thing that changes here, besides your shock, is the spring leaf itself, which will be rated to carry a different load. For this one, I definitely wanted adjustable bypass because the canopy load can vary, so it was more a matter of just getting the correct spring load for what I needed, and obviously your prices change here because you do have different components. In the end, after calculating the weights, I went for the Expedition HD at 300 kilograms. So you can see here, it's an expected 40mm lift at 300 kilos. So the 40mm lift that they talk about here is from the factory at no load. So this line here at 600mm, this is our center of hub to guard measurement. That will raise at 300 kilograms with the 300 kilogram constants by 40mm compared to the factory at nothing. So it's 40mm higher than here. Because the factory suspension is currently under this 300 kilograms already, our actual expected lift is probably going to be closer to 70mm, going from about 570 here up to 640. So you won't see a 40mm lift if you already have these loads applied. You'll see greater than 40mm. It's 40mm higher than the factory suspension with no load. This green line here is the maximum acceptable center wheel guard measurement. So you can see that they cross this threshold, the yellow at 300, the purple at 500, the blue at 150 at the spring load rating that they're rated for. So 300 kilos crosses this threshold here, and that's why it's 300 kilos. You wouldn't use this any less because you'll exceed that CWG rating there. Now, for the rear, it is basically the same thing, but the problems that we come into by raising too high is actually the center bearing. So this is the center bearing here. It's basically the drive shaft from the transfer case back to the rear diff, has a bearing in the middle, and this should be straight to have no vibrations. As you lift the car, this angle changes, and you need to try and get that center bearing as straight as possible to get rid of those vibrations. So with that in mind, first things first, I had to figure out what I had in the back, and then remove the weight of the tub to see how much weight has been added to the back. So you can see I've got a fair bit of stuff in the back. I've got solar panels, awnings, roof bars, floodlights on top, and the antenna. Then inside we've got the battery, fridge, drawer table combo, overhead shelves, and then we have the headboard with all the cables and stuff like that as well. Worked out to, I think it was about 350 kilos. So it's between the 300 kilogram constant load and the 500 kilogram constant load. And again, for me, same as with the front, I'd rather be undersprung a little bit rather than oversprung. It'll be a much better ride going for the 300 kilogram leaf springs than it would if I went for the 500 kilo leaf springs. The other advantage of this obviously is that the lift will be less, which means it'll be easier to negate that center bearing angle change and get that straight again to get rid of all the vibrations. Now the adjustable bypass, again, this is probably more important in the rear because that's where you'll have changing loads as you load up the canopy or the tray or whatever you have. Then you can sort of change the ride to suit that. Now as for the bump stops, it's just one of those things that I figured I may as well do because I'm going to have everything apart anyway, especially on the rear. You'll be taking off the rear bump stops by changing out the leaf springs, so you may as well upgrade them to a more comfortable progressive bump stop. The difference with these bump stops is that they're just a little bit taller, but they are softer on impact and they get harder the more it compresses. So it is called progressive, and it is basically that it softens that initial blow and just absorbs some of those bumps a little bit better. So just briefly, the kit that I've got, I haven't got both leaf springs here obviously, but there's leaf spring for either side, front shock for either side. I went with the progressive bump stops. All this does is engage the bump stop earlier, but it has a softer compression at the top, and obviously that increases as it compresses further. I've done that on the front and rear. That's the front. So that's the kit there. There's the threaded seat down the bottom there. Grub screw supposed to be in there, but is missing, so I'll go buy one. Now you can buy these as separate parts. I've just gone for the full kit, which comes with the upper strut mount here, and it's just a lot easier to install. You don't need a compressor spring. These are quite heavy duty springs that are very hard to compress. So even if I wanted to change this seat mount, I probably would need to take it somewhere because I don't think the spring compressors I have are strong enough to compress this spring. So the measurement from the bottom of this notch to just here where the thread ends is 14 millimeters. I'm not sure how much thread is left to wind out or how much goes in. It also comes with these spacers which look about 5 mil if you want extra ride height. However, this may void the warranty if you use these. It depends how high the lift is. Now this box here just has center bearing spacer kit, greasable shackles, new U-bolts. We'll go over all this once we install it. So to get an idea of the lift that we're putting in, we measure from the center of the wheel to the guard, CWG measurement, and may as well measure from the ground to the guard as well. So from the ground we got 902 and we got about 546. It's hard to get the center of the wheel, but that is roughly what we're at. It's 546. Now unfortunately I forgot to measure it originally, so I've already done the left hand corner, so this might not be a true representation of the lift considering the left hand corner is actually pushing this side up a little bit already. It was actually sagged a little bit lower than this before. So we got 505 from the center wheel to the guard and 801 from the ground to the guard here, but obviously this is a aftermarket canopy. It might not sit at the same height as the tub would have. So chock the rear wheels, handbrake on, brake tension on these before we lift the car, and then we'll just get this wheel off. The car jacked up, obviously it's on stands. We don't use the jack to support it. Got a stand there, got the wheel underneath just in case the stand fails. This jack or a similar jack we'll need just to help manipulate this and take the pressure off and on to the shock absorber as we work around. So just to have an idea of what we're working with, upper control arm, the upper control arm ball joint. This is how we remove the upper control arm from the knuckle. These are the steering rods. This here is our drive axle or our CV joint. Got the lower control arm down here, which is where the suspension connects to. This line here we'll be disconnecting. This is a brake line, so we got a clip here to unclip. We got another one up here that can be unclipped or unbolted, and we also have this line here which is a wheel speed sensor. That is for the ABS or the traction control or both. Now on the floor here, this is a sway bar. This connects onto the front of the car here. These two horseshoe clamps or saddles. That goes to the sway bar link. I've already disconnected this because I wanted the sway bar out. I've already done the other side. But basically this sway bar connects onto this knuckle, and then the other end will connect into that. I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. But I've taken that out. To take that out, just disconnect the bolt on both sides and then undo these pieces here that connect to the chassis. Now on the top here we have one central bolt, that is your piston rod nut. We don't touch that at all, especially with the car jacked up and no tension on the spring. So 3 outer bolts, they're the strut mounts. That's what we'll be loosening off. Now in the workshop manual, it does actually mention doing this without removing the upper control arm ball joint, but I think it is a little bit easier by removing this upper control arm ball joint. So this is a relatively easy job, it's quite quick to do, but we do want to make sure we remove all these sensor cables just so they don't get stretched, because this whole component has to drop down in order to drop this out from the upper control arm. So the reason the sway bar has been removed is because the easiest way to get this coilover in is kind of past where the sway bar blocks. With the brake line, we've got 2 brackets, you can loosen that. Looks like a 13. And another one up there also looks like a 13. The alternative to that is releasing these pinching clips. All you need to do is kind of wedge that out, rock it back and forth, a pair of sideys or pliers just to get that out. With this speed sensor, we've got these white clips. They can be brittle and snap, but we're just going to try to get them out with a flat blade screwdriver or a pry bar, a small one. So that's the brake line loose. This one here is a little 8mm socket. Now all our brackets are clear, and I've actually already got the sway bar off, so if you haven't done that, just unlink that. Now the next thing I'll do is I'll take the bolt at the bottom of the shock absorber. So this one here, 21mm. You might need a breaker bar for it, could be tight. Alright, so next we're just going to break this. So we've got a pin in here to remove. This is 21mm. We're going to loosen it, but we're going to leave full thread engagement. Then we're going to smash this with a hammer just to break that ball joint. Alright, next, I'm going to loosen these 3, leaving about 1 thread left on top. Okay, so the old ones are 14, I think the new ones are 15. Now I'm going to use this jack here, just to support under this lower control arm, and I'm going to wind this off. This will give a little bit. This is under a tiny bit of tension. It's not anything to do with the spring, so we don't need to worry about it too much. Having the jack ender here supports the lower control arm from dropping. Just means the knuckle and the axle will move out a bit, and then we can lower that in a controlled way. So back to the 21mm. So that's why I've got these loose, is because this pops off, there's no tension on anything. Now we remove these 3, and then we can get this strut out. With the assembled strut kit, we get a new upper control mount. We don't need to reuse these nuts. Now we slowly release the tension on this jack, and then everything should be able to just drop out. So although everything else in the kit is correct, they did not supply me with grub screws. These cost about $1 each, or even less actually. It's just annoying having to go down to the shops and get one. In case you're wondering, 8mm long, M5, bit of Loctite, 2.5mm Allen key. Okay, so just before we put the suspension in, the front bump stop, I'm just going to do it here while I've got more access. All we need to do is screw this out. And then in the kit for the new one, we have a washer, which is recommended for winch and bull bar setups. And then we have spacers if we need them. And we have these, which we will use the short end into the back of this. The long end will go where the bump stop attaches to the chassis there, and Loctite on everything. So to remove this, a Nipex or something similar. So here's the old bump stop and the new one. You can see it's just a little bit taller, so it engages earlier, makes it a little bit less harsh. That's the theory behind it. Now you can mount it just like this. You can add this cup to it, or you can add washers in between the two to make it sit a little bit higher. I'm just going to mount it through this cup. So as you tighten the rubber into the threaded entry, obviously that little stud bolt tightens itself into the rubber part as well as that at the same time. So when we're putting the new strut in, just going to make sure you have one pointing to the outside, because that's the way the other one came out, so it'll be like that. Now obviously you've got to take these nuts off on top. That threaded seat adjustment, you need that set before you put it in the car. I'm leaving it how it came out with the intent of possibly lowering it later if the CV angles are too bad. But I want to see how it sits, how it rides. I don't think my CV angles will be too bad. So ordinarily that sway bar would actually come across here and block this entrance, which is the easiest way to put it in. And now's the time to put Loctite on these. So I will be torquing it in this position now, but also after I've gone for a drive just to let the suspension settle a bit, I'll go through and re-torque it again. The bolt that goes through here, we won't be torquing until the weight of the car is on it, and we'll just jump on the bull bar a bit, go through the motion of the shock absorber, let this seat itself properly, and then we'll torque it. go get a wheel alignment, and then we'll check everything again at 1000 Ks or thereabouts. So the 3 new nuts up here are 15 mil, and we'll do these up to 55 Newton meters. So we can't get the torque wrench on the one in the corner, so we just see how hard it is to move these. Apply the same pressure to the one in the corner. If your strut bushing needs twisting, you can move them a tiny bit just by gripping them, something preferably with smooth jaws, and you can actually twist it into position. So we've got the bolt on the bottom shock, but it's not tight. So now we can start putting all this back together using the help of that jack to lift the lower control arm so we can get this bolt through the upper control arm. 21 mil, 63 Newton meters. Don't need to worry about these torque settings, just put a bit of Loctite on, do it up with a 1/4 inch. One here was our 8 mil. 13 mil up here for the brake. Same again here, don't worry about torque settings. So I've just put the sway bar link in, everything's loose at the moment, nothing's torqued. Everything for this stabiliser bar will get done to 90 Newton meters. So that's our stabiliser bar there. It is on a ball joint, so it does move, and this bolt is also on the ball joint, so it does move. Just got to guide that through there. 90 Newton meters, and these are 18 mil sockets. So it's pretty awkward to get a torque wrench on there, but 90 Newton meters with a spanner this length is kind of basically as hard as you can do it. So I've got the wheels on both sides. I'm just going to torque these to 103 in a crisscross pattern, and then we can do our lower suspension mount to 235 Newton meters. Now my torque wrench goes to 210, so I'll do it at 210, and then I'll just do a tiny bit more with a breaker bar. The point is, it's got to be very tight. It doesn't matter if it's exactly 235. Just going to bounce on the suspension a bit. So all we're doing is getting this bushing in here to sit where it's going to sit in normal driving conditions, and now we torque it up. So with the rear, crack the tension. Now we can lift from the diff, but we place the stands under the chassis because we need the diff to droop, because we need to decompress the leaf springs. So we're using that jack, still got it underneath the diff pumpkin there, and I'm going to use that to lower and raise the diff as we need to, because we do need to lower this quite a way to get the new leaf springs in especially, but also to get the old ones out. I've done one shock absorber over there. The other one is this here. This here is our bump stop with the U-bolts. This sort of connects the diff to the leaf spring, which is connected to the chassis. And there you have your leaf spring front bolt, and then the rear one down here on the shackles. So first things first, we'll be taking out the shock. And these are not so tight, they're not as tight as the front ones were. The front ones are tighter, obviously, because they have the old spring assembly. So the bolts for the shock we do reuse, but all the bolts and nuts and washers for the springs, we get all new equipment. And these are both 18 mil, top and bottom. Now we'll start to loosen these 4 bolts here. So there's no tension on this, it's safe to get all these off. And these are 21 mil. Factory one and the aftermarket one. So you can see the spring close up as the tension comes on. So we're just going to lower that until there's no tension on that spring. It pops out of the locating hole in the diff there. So now we know that that spring's all good to go. Just going to lower it a little bit further to get us a bit more freedom of movement to get the spring out. And especially when we need to get the new one in, we need quite a bit of room to move. And we'll take this off, an 18 mil socket for this. These bolts we actually don't need anymore. These are both 21 mil. And just remove all the old bushings from inside the chassis because we have new ones to use. I've basically split the kit in half, so what you see here is one half of the kit, one for each side of the car. 2 larger ones here go in the front with the metal sleeve through the middle of that. The 2 shortest ones here go in the back of the leaf spring. These 2 here go over the shackle at this top half here that goes through the chassis. We have this grease that comes packaged with it. The outside of each of these bushings goes as a rubber to metal, and then obviously the outsides of these which go through there and the point in the chassis that the shackle connects to. Now the new leaf springs, because they are stronger, they do have more of a bend in it, so we might need to drop the diff a little bit more. The distance to the front is shorter to the center bolt than it is to the back. So the long end goes towards the back of the car, short end goes to the front of the car. Short end is the one with the larger bushes. On the bottom of the leaf springs, in the middle, we have this locating pin. Now that needs to sit in this central hole on the diff, and that stops things from moving around. So we have this greasable shackle pin for the front. Now obviously you want the grease nipple to the outside here, so especially with the muffler there, we won't be able to access it the other way. In fact, you can't even push it in the other way, but on the other side, you can have it either way. It's better to have this grease nipple to the outside. So although I can lift this to get this bolt in, what I want to try and do is use the jack to lift it to get the bolt in, and then I can keep that locator pin, which is currently seated in the right spot, I can keep it in there, because otherwise you lift this up and then it can be a pain sometimes to get that locator pin in. So I'm just going to put these on hand tight on the other side. So drop the diff to a comfortable position, but making sure the locator pin stays in the diff, because that's an annoying piece to get in later. This side's a bit harder than the other side because of the exhaust in the way. So all I'm doing is using this plate with these nuts to draw the bushings in properly, but keeping that center bolt aligned. I will leave this for now because we'll torque this up later. So we'll move on to the U-bolts. So if you've got that locator pin in the middle there, then we're going to start on these U-bolts. Now these can be torqued up now. We don't need to wait until the weight of the car is on, but we can go through them again later. And we'll torque each of these to 120. So I'll go through and torque them all at about 90 first, with any bolts, but U-bolts especially, as you tighten one, you affect the tightness of the other. So you want to go just half a turn at a time or one full turn at a time at the start, and then slowly torque them down that way. So you want to get them all at 120 at the same time. I'll do them all at 90 first, and then I'll do that last little bit up to 120. So these are 22mm. We have a new bump stop. Not entirely sure I got the right part here because I've tightened the other one up and this still has a little bit of play in it. So I'm going to have to contact Outback Armour about that. So one thing to note when you're tightening these up, don't have the U-bolts like that. You want them hard up against this lip here, so they're dead straight on both sides. You don't want to torque it like that because it can go like that and then you have that little bit of play there. So make sure everything's hard up and square. You can put Loctite 30-40mm down, that's where the threads will end up sitting. That's all of them at 90, now we go up to 120. It's everything at 120. I don't really like how this bump stop is still a little bit loose. Definitely can't come out, but just seems a little bit weird. Now we're going to put this rear shock absorber in, hand tight, like we did on the front. We're going to lower the car, we're going to bounce on it, get it moving up and down, get the bushings to seat with the weight of the car on it, plus a little bit of movement, and then we'll go through and torque all the bushings. So the rear shock, we've got the adjustable bypass, keep that on the bottom so it's easy to access. You can spin this to orientate it, and you can compress this and stretch it to get it to fit. We are reusing the existing bolts for the rear shocks. So car and its wheels, we just jump on it a bit before we torque anything with a bush through it. So both of these are 18mm and we torque them to 48 Nm. So on the shackle at the back we have 103 Nm and that applies to both. I'm going to take them out one at a time just to get Loctite on there. On the rear here we have a 20mm. So in front of the leaf shackle, this one is 162 Nm and this is a 19mm. Okay, so on the back we've also got the 6 greasable bolts or pins, and these go through the shackles. We've got one on each side at the front and 2 on each side at the back. So just quickly on the rear, I've done the same on the front and the back. On the front, you have about 29 or 30 clicks of adjustment. On the rear, I'm counting about 25. Every now and then you want to go through the full range just to keep everything lubricated. And then what I'm doing is just going full clockwise and then turning back. So on the front, I went back 14, I think, to about halfway. On this one, I'll just take it back 10. And they say when you adjust them to fine tune them, move it by 2 clicks at a time because you probably won't tell the difference with 1 click. I'd probably move it by about 5 at a time. So I'll see what it's like in this setup and then we'll change it later. So in the centre bearing spacing kit, some instructions: 2 new bolts, 3 spacers per bolt, So you can use 2 or 3 or 1 depending on how big a drop you need. And then you have the spring and flat to tighten up the bolt to. So I'm going to start with all 3 and then we'll see how we go from there. What we need to do is support this, remove some of these bolts and then put our spacers in. So I moved a trolley jack underneath just in case it dropped, but it's quite easy to control the weight. The bolts are quite tight, they were 15mm to get off. The new ones we put on will be 21mm. Bit of Loctite on there. I went straight for the 3 spacers. So you just got to sort of slide that in there and then do them all up. And the final torque settings, it says between 25 to 35 Newton meters, so I just did them up to 35 Newton meters. So here's a closer look at what it looks like. So you got your spring and your flat on the outside supporting that bolt and then the 3 spacers in between. Now we'll look at the change in angles. Okay, so using the GoPro, putting it above the exhaust, I've got 3 shots here that I've lined up by dropping the opacity and lining up all the components of the drive shaft. This is original suspension. I did have 350 kilos in the back, 179 degrees, so it's kind of gone past that straight, which is 180 to 179. Could have actually been 178. You can see after the lift, before I put the spacers in, it's dropped 4 or 5 degrees towards the tail. So at the center bearing, we're now at 183 degrees. So there is a big change there, depending on whether the original was 178 or 179. Now, with the 3 spacers in and the constant 300 kilo leaf springs, we're back to that 179, like the original suspension was with this load. It could even be 178 or 180. It's kind of hard to tell from this angle, but it's a lot straighter than before. Could arguably use 2 spacers here, but pretty happy with the results with 3. So on the front now, we've gone from 546 CWG measurement to 612. So that's a raise of 66. But like I was saying before, I think it's actually raised more because I forgot to measure it before I had already changed the front left-hand side. So it has raised probably more than 66mm. But at the moment, we have a front CWG measurement of 612. Now why this is important is because the actual shock absorber itself, if we look at the components here, it actually states that it has a recommended maximum CWG measurement of 600mm. It is 12mm higher than that at the moment. At the moment, I've still probably got 10 to 15 kilos of bash plates to put on. The car's only done about 10 kilometres to get a wheel alignment, so I wouldn't be surprised if it does settle a little bit more. So I'm not too worried about that 12mm. And just out of interest, from the wheel guard to the ground, we are now at 968. So on the rear here, from the ground, we've gone from 861 to 975, and CWG, we've gone from 505 to 620. So we've got an increase of 115mm here. Now, where this is hard for me is to compare this canopy wheel guard to where the factory wheel guard would sit. So if we look at the equivalent rates from this chart here, you can see with the stock leaf springs at 300 kilos or 350 kilos, they expected a 565mm CWG measurement, whereas I originally had 505. So that's a discrepancy of 60mm. And then with these new 300 kilogram constant leaf springs, at about 350 kilos, which is what I've got in the back, they expected a CWG measurement of 635. What I'm currently getting on the BT-50 here is 620 to the canopy's wheel guard, but that's only a difference of 15mm. So it's really hard to suss out what the difference is between the canopy wheel guard and the factory tub wheel guard. With the stock, we had 60mm. With the lift, we have a 15mm difference. We average that out, we can get about 37mm difference, and that would put the equivalent CWG measurement at about 657mm. This is higher than this rear shock, which has a maximum recommended of 640mm. That is 17mm higher than the recommendation. But again, this is really guesswork because I don't know what the equivalent wheel guard height is. This is just figuring out a rough average. And again, I'm not too worried about this because I believe that it will settle a little bit. The car's only done 10 Ks. In about 1,000 kilometres, I might remeasure it all when I re-torque everything. So just quickly, CV angles. That's the CV there. And we're just going to look at the differences. This is afterwards. Now I'll just quickly flick through before and after so you can see the difference. So you can see there's a lot more stress on that CV joint after the lift, so hopefully this settles. So all up, this cost me $3,000. Now, if you look at the individual components up here, they actually cost a little bit more than that. And being from WA, normally you'd be charged freight, but I called around and went through Medicar in Bibra Lake, and they offered me the best price. They just capped it at $3,000, and they included shipping in that. I phoned around a few other mobs, and they wanted to charge a full price, and they wanted to include freight on top of that. So if you're in WA, then check out Medicar. So I was surprised by some of these weights. All the shackles and bushes, we added 1.206 kilos, and with the rubber bump stops, so that's the front and the rear, we've added 0.459 kilos there. For the front strut assemblies, now obviously these are a lot more heavy duty, but it's 3.412 kilos added per side, which is quite a lot. The leaf's the same, we got 29.155 on the new ones. We've added 5.079 kilos per leaf spring. The rear shocks, 4.3, these are way bigger, it's almost twice as much from 2.3 on the old one, so 2 kilos added each. Center bearing spacing kit gives us a total weight added of 22.846 kilos. Okay, so I've taken the car for a wheel alignment now, and that's all good. I've taken it for a little test drive. The difference is crazy. Like, it's probably the most significant change I've made to the car in terms of the way it drives. It no longer feels like it weighs 3 tonne, it feels like it weighs about 2 tonne. It feels safer around corners, and it feels safer under brakes as well. And this is all on-road, so those benefits will only be amplified when you're off-road. I was worried about driveline vibrations in the rear, but luckily I haven't experienced anything yet in the 10 to 15 Ks that I've done so far. It's driving exactly the same as it was before, except with better handling and braking. So on the front shock assemblies, I've counted 29 or 30 clicks. Sometimes it seems to differ depending on which direction I'm going. I went full clockwise and back 14 clicks. On the rear, I counted about 25 clicks, so I went full clockwise and then back 10. Somewhere around halfway for each of them, and it's driving pretty good at the moment. The next thing I might do is go full anti-clockwise all around the car, and then go for a drive, and then full clockwise all around the car, go for a drive, see how it behaves differently, and then fine-tune it from there. So overall, I wouldn't say it's a really hard job, but you do need a few garage tools in terms of car stands, jacks, bottle jacks, breaker bars. I recommend getting a ratchet head for your breaker bar, and just your general socket set and spanner kit will come in handy for this. The only other thing you might need that not a lot of people probably would have is a grease gun. But the grease gun I had only cost me about $60, and you can find even cheaper ones than that. All the tools that I used will be linked in the description, and any questions, just leave them down below. Now we'll just look at the running costs and weights of the BT-50 build. Thanks for watching. Going to cover the increase the CV angle that you might need, that not control arm, then we can lower that control, so you can before and after, as well as you need like car junk. So I've got the wheels on both. I personally, so the less lift. So although everything in, we're going to bounce out in the bushes, and I fit that